The story begins with a bank sign quietly coming down in Tehran. By administrative order, the maroon emblem of Ayandeh Bank, once the symbol of Iran's splashiest private finance and mega-project ambition, now gives way to the sober green of Bank Melli, Iran. The switchover is more than cosmetic. It is the capstone to a collapse years in the making, ballooning overdrafts, insider lending, and a capital hole so deep that the central bank finally brought the curtain down, folding Ayandeh into the state-run behemoth to contain the risk to the wider system. In the financial district, you can feel the unease. Depositors queue to confirm their funds are safe. Staff are told their jobs continue under a new name. The government insists this is stabilization, not surrender, but in the streets, the whispered verdict is simpler. Another bank gone, another bill for the public. What makes this failure different is the web of names and places it touches far beyond Iran. Trace the connections and you end up in 3 European cities, London, Hamburg and Paris, where Iran-linked banking footprints have long intersected with sanctions policy, court battles and compliance grey zones. The question that drives this narrative is not just how Ayandeh failed, but what its implosion reveals about Iran's political economy under Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and how funds connected to Iran's power networks have historically found channels, legitimate or illicit, into Europe's financial arteries. Inside Iran, the official numbers are stark. In late October 2025, the central bank said Ayandeh carried about 5 quadrillion rials, approximately $4.7 billion in debt, and had showered loans far in excess of prudential limits, much of it to insiders and related projects. Economists called it a case study in governance failure, a negative capital adequacy ratio hundreds of percentage points below even minimal Basel standards, emergency central bank borrowing that fueled inflation, and a property portfolio whose crown jewel, the vast Iran Mall, will now be sold to plug the hole. As one analyst put it, the hidden cost will again be borne by households through the slow erosion of purchasing power. The politics around the decision were just as blunt. Iran's judiciary chief, Gholam Mohseni Ejei, publicly pressed the central bank governor to act, an extraordinary shove broadcast to millions. Mr. Fazin, you have sufficient legal mandate to make any decision about Ayandeh Bank. Do your legal duty, or else we will come in and increase costs for you, said Gholam Mohseni Ejei, Chief Justice of Iran. The message landed. Within days, Ayandeh was gone. From Ayandeh's side, the pushback framed the bankruptcy as externally driven. The bankruptcy came as a result of decisions and policies that were made outside the bank's control, said Ali Ansari, Ayandeh's founder and major shareholder, adding that his conscience was clear and the bank had left valuable legacies. The same week, UK authorities added a new Iran-related designation involving an Ansari, imposing asset freeze and travel restrictions, a reminder that European enforcement remains alive to Iran-linked finance, even when the origins are thousands of miles away. To understand how we arrived here, you have to place Ayandeh within the larger architecture of power and money in the Islamic Republic. Above the cabinet and parliament sits a single office with sweeping discretion, the supreme leader. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has held that post since 1989, appointing top security, judicial and media chiefs, and, crucially, exerting decisive influence over the economy's commanding heights. His stance on nuclear policy still sets the bounds of negotiation. Ali Khamenei. The proposal that the Americans have presented is 100% against our interests. Who are you to decide whether Iran should have enrichment? Those words, delivered in June 2025, explain much about why sanctions relief remains elusive and why Iranian banks operate under exceptional pressure. Under Khamenei's umbrella sit parastatal empires, among them the execution of Imam Khomeini's order, EIKO/Setad, that have long commanded assets across energy, telecoms, pharma and finance. US Treasury actions repeatedly describe Setad as a network used to hide assets on behalf of Iran's leadership and to channel value through subsidiaries. Whether or not a given private bank is directly tied to Setad, the broader system is shaped by these power centers and by a sanctions environment that nudges capital toward opacity. Now to Europe's 3 cities, London first. 2 names capture the long-running friction between policy and practice. Persia International Bank, PIB, formed from the London branches of Bank Melli and Bank Tejarat and Melli Bank plc, a UK subsidiary of Bank Melli Iran. Over the years, PIB has oscillated between inclusion on sanctions lists and legal wins that forced EU authorities to reassess evidence. Its filings and annual reports attest to continued regulated activity under UK/EU law, albeit with a compliance burden few mid-sized banks would envy. Melli's UK arm, sanctioned by the EU in 2008 and later delisted in 2016, remains a lightning rod each time Iran policy tightens. None of this proves that a specific Iranian political figure's money sits in London. It does show that London has been, for 2 decades, the most scrutinised European hub for Iran-linked banking, with formal on-the-books institutions that regulators monitor closely. Hamburg next, home to Europäische Iranische Handelsbank, EEH, a German-registered bank with a long history of facilitating Iran-related trade. EIH was the subject of EU asset freezes and court fights as Brussels sought to close back channels for designated Iranian banks. Legal opinions out of Luxembourg and decisions catalogued by Reuters document how EIH's activities came to symbolize the challenge of drawing clean lines in a murky sanctions landscape. Again, this does not assert that Ayandeh or Khamenei's personal funds transited Hamburg. It establishes that Hamburg has been a European pressure point whenever Iran-related banking is tested, and Paris. Bank Melli Iran's European footprint has included a presence in France, consistent with Melli's long list of foreign branches and subsidiaries. EU sanctions froze Melli assets in 2008. Following delisting during the brief JCPOA thaws, Melli's European activities resumed within regulatory guardrails. For investigators following Ayandeh's asset unwind under Bank Melli's control, the French angle matters because any cross-border recoveries or receivables must pass through jurisdictions where Melli has corporate arms, branches, or historical relationships, and where EU sanctions law, blocking statutes, and secondary sanctions exposure all collide. The practical consequence of Ayandeh's failure is that Iran's state now owns the problem and the pipes. Bank Melli will sort what's saleable from what's not, with the central bank pledging that somehow all of the assets but none of the imbalances will transfer. In reality, as Al Jazeera's accounting shows, a large share of the losses ends up socialized via the Deposit Guarantee Fund, via inflationary financing, or via slow-motion asset sales at discounts. It's a cleanup many Iranians have seen before. Beyond Iran's borders, enforcement is visibly tightening. Today's UK move added a fresh designation tied by reporters to an Ansari with links to Ayandeh's shareholder circle, a signal that London is still probing Iran-related wealth trails and that European capitals are more willing to coordinate with Washington when evasion patterns surface. Across the Atlantic, the US Treasury has been explicit about its intent. Scott Bessent, US Secretary of the Treasury will continue to disrupt Iran's schemes aimed at evading our sanctions, block its access to revenue, and starve its weapons programs of capital in order to protect the American people. The message to banks from London to Hamburg to Paris is unmistakable. AML and sanctions risk around Iran is not cyclical, it is structural. Inside Tehran, the decisions are playing out under a political ceiling that has barely shifted in decades. Khamenei remains the final arbiter, Ali Khamenei. Uranium enrichment is the key to our nuclear program. The proposal that the Americans have presented is 100% against our interests. That hard line means sanctions relief will remain distant unless the Supreme Leader himself recalibrates, leaving Iran's formal banks to walk a narrow path at home and abroad and leaving Europe's supervisors to sift constantly for risk. The Pezeshkian presidency is the backdrop, not the driver of banking policy. His government has floated sweeping domestic priorities, from environmental alarm about Tehran's future to a reorganization of national defense coordination, yet none of it changes the core financial constraint. With sanctions intact and market confidence shaken by collapses like Ayandeh's, capital formation is expensive and fragile. Even if the administration pushes technocratic reforms, as long as political vetoes sit elsewhere, execution will falter. For viewers trying to decode the European angle, it helps to separate channels from claims. London's Persia International Bank and Melli Bank plc are licensed, regulated entities whose public filings and periodic court cases are part of the record. Hamburg's EIH has likewise lived under a magnifying glass for years. Paris sits within Melli's broader European constellation. each city's relevance does not automatically validate any specific allegation about the personal wealth of a given Iranian leader or a particular private bank's funds. What it establishes is a map of plausible conduits, legitimate or otherwise, through which Iranian-linked finance has historically tried to reach global markets, and where European regulators have the most tools and the longest memory. This is also why the Ayandeh unwind matters beyond Iran. As Bank Melli assumes its assets, any overseas claims, receivables or counterparties that touch Europe will move into a sanctions-exposed lane. In London, that will mean granular scrutiny of correspondent relationships and any exposure to Melli affiliates. In Hamburg, compliance officers will recheck past authorizations and licenses against updated EU Council listings. In Paris, where blocking statutes complicate the reach of US secondary sanctions, General Counsel will again triage the familiar puzzle: what's permitted under EU law, what's prohibited under US rules, and how to avoid becoming the next test case in Luxembourg. One scene captures the contradictions. In Tehran, a new plaque goes up on a former Ayandeh branch, now rebadged as Bank Melli. Staff gather as officials explain the process. Accounts migrate, contracts remain in force, interest accrues as before. Across the city, shoppers step into Iran Mall, still gleaming, still full. Everyone knows the mall will likely be sold, but no one can say when or for how much. Outside Iran, in London and Hamburg and Paris, compliance teams skim headlines and adjust internal watch lists. The names are familiar, the risk is not new, but Ayandeh's fall snaps attention back to the same choke points, because sooner or later, value tries to move. We end with three voices that frame the stakes. Gholam Hossein Mohseni AJ, Chief Justice of Iran. Mr. Farzin, you have sufficient legal mandate to make any decision about Ayandeh Bank. Do your legal duty, or else we will come in and increase costs for you. The domestic order to pull the plug. Ali Ansari, Ayandeh's founder and major shareholder. The bankruptcy came as a result of decisions and policies that were made outside the bank's control. The counter-narrative of blame. Scott Bessent, US Secretary of the Treasury. Treasury will continue to disrupt Iran's schemes aimed at evading our sanctions, block its access to revenue, and starve its weapons programs of capital in order to protect the American people, the promise of sustained enforcement. As for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the decisive words that shape the policy horizon remain his. The proposal that the Americans have presented is 100% against our interests. Who are you to decide whether Iran should have enrichment? Until that doctrine shifts, Europe's financial capitals will keep bracing for the next Iranian banking story that shows up on their doorstep. Al Jazeera on Ayandeh's dissolution, debt, insider lending, and quotes by Mohseni AJ and Ali Ansari. Financial Times/Bloomberg on the merger of Ayandeh into Bank Melli and the timeline. Reuters on Khamenei's June 4th, 2025 nuclear remarks. UK designation coverage. Reuters referencing an Ansari and fresh sanctions action. US Treasury press release and summary actions on Iran sanctions. ICO/Setad network and 2025 enforcement posture. Open source records on London, Hamburg, Paris banking footprints. Persia International Bank, Melli Bank, PLC EIH EU cases.